Episode 1. The Cold War Explained. From Allies to Enemies. They fought side by side to defeat Adolf Hitler, but only a few short years later, they stood on opposite sides of an invisible battlefield. Two nations once allies now trapped in a 40-year struggle for power, fear, and ideology. Join us as we uncover 5 defining chapters in the Cold War, a struggle that changed history without a single direct battle. 1. The end of World War II. In 1945, the Second World War came to an end. The victors, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union celebrated triumph over tyranny. Yet peace did not bring harmony. It brought suspicion. The world's two rising superpowers, Washington and Moscow, no longer needed each other. Now, each feared what the other might become. At the peace conferences, they promised cooperation, but beneath the polite words, mistrust ran deep. Joseph Stalin feared Western betrayal. The West feared Stalin's ambitions. 2. Two ideologies, one planet. The world was no longer divided by oceans or borders, it was divided by ideas. On one side stood capitalism and democracy, led by the United States. On the other, communism and state control, commanded by the Soviet Union. Each believed its system would save humanity. Each saw the other as a threat to the future. 3. Europe divided, the Iron Curtain descends. As Soviet armies liberated Eastern Europe, they never withdrew. Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Romania all fell under Moscow's shadow. In 1946, Winston Churchill warned the world, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind it, censorship, fear, and one-party rule. Beyond it, prosperity, freedom, and anxiety of a different kind." 4. The response, the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. In 1947, President Harry Truman announced a new policy, the Truman Doctrine, promising to help any nation resisting communism. The following year came the Marshall Plan, a massive effort pouring billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe. Where Americans saw generosity, Stalin saw manipulation, a Western plot to buy loyalty and surround the Soviet Union with hostile allies. Europe was no longer one continent. It was two worlds, divided by power and fear. 5. The nuclear shadow emerges. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. America's monopoly on nuclear power was gone. Humanity now lived a new kind of terror, two nations, each capable of ending all life on Earth. This uneasy peace was held trust, but by the fear of mutual destruction. A fragile balance, a Cold War, fought with bullets, but with spies, propaganda, and political pressure. Over the next 4 decades, this silent conflict would reach every corner of the world, from the streets of Berlin to the mountains of Korea, from Cuba to outer space. The Cold War was never declared and never truly ended. It was a battle of visions, a fight for the heart and soul of the modern age. Subscribe for episode 2, with Spies, the Iron Curtain, and political pressure. The Cold War series, USA versus USSR, 40 years that
the streets of Berlin to the mountains of Korea, from Cuba to outer space. The Cold War was never declared and never truly ended. It was a battle of visions, a fight for the heart and soul of the modern
War series. The Iron Curtain. How Europe was divided. Episode. The Second World War had ended, but peace brought no comfort. Across Europe, victory gave way to fear. A new shadow stretched from the Baltic to the Baltic, a shadow that Winston Churchill would call the Iron Curtain. Join us as we uncover defining chapters in the Cold War. A story that changed without a direct battle. 1. The aftermath of war. 1945. Europe ruins. City in ashes. Economies collapsed. And homeless. The continent that once the world now depended on the mercy of powers. The United States and the Soviet Union. Both had fought side by side to defeat Nazi Germany. But now, this for the post-war world had been more different. 2. Stalin's expansion and the birth of the Eastern Bloc. In the East, Joseph Stalin Stalin moved quickly to secure his influence. He communist got loyal to Moscow in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and East Germany. The Soviet Union called it liberation. The West called it occupation. Behind these new borders, the press was censored, elections were controlled, and opposition was silent. Stalin's goal was clear: to create a wall of friendly nations, protecting the Soviet Union from any future invasion. 3. Churchill's warning. The Iron Curtain speech. In March of 1940, Winston delivered in Fulton. It's echoed across the world, from Stettin, Baltic, to Trieste in the Adriatic. An iron curtain has it across the continent. It was more for. It was the birth of a divided world, East and West, Communist and Soviet. 4. The Westerns. Containment and reconstruction. 1947. Harry Truman and his policy of promising Soviet expansion wherever it appeared. That same year, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed a plan to rebuild Europe's shattered economies. The Marshall Plan offered billions of dollars in aid, but only to countries willing to cooperate with the West. Nations that accepted American aid prospered. Those that refused under Soviet pressure fell further behind. The divide between East and West was no longer just political. It was economic, cultural, and deeply human. 5. Life behind the curtain. Behind the Iron Curtain, life was ruled by fear and control. The secret police watched everyone. Dissent meant prison or worse. But there was also pride. Pride in rebuilding, in equality, in being part of a powerful socialist bloc. Meanwhile, in the West, freedom brought its own struggle, prosperity mixed with paranoia and the constant fear of communist infiltration. 6. Berlin. The city at the heart of the divide. Nowhere symbolized of Europe more than Berlin. Berlin. Stalin lived to the aid, humiliated, but not Berlin. Stalin lived to the aid, humiliated, but not defeated. 2. Europe. 2 futures. In 1949, the West nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO, a military alliance to defend against Soviet aggression. In response, 6 later, in 1955, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact, uniting its satellite states under Moscow's command. Europe was now armed to the teeth. A continent divided ideology, ended by fear, and separated by barbed wire. The Iron Curtain was more than a map. It was a cutting through nations, cities, and hearts. For nearly half a century, it would define the lives of millions. Behind it, the Cold War would spread Asia, Africa, and a struggle not for land, but for the soul of the modern world. Subscribe for Ep 3, Nuclear Standoff. The Age of Mad, Mutually Assured Destruction. The Core Series USA versus USSR. 40 years that the world. For nearly half a century, it would define the lives of millions. Behind it, the Cold War would spread Asia, Africa, and a struggle not for land, but for the soul of
The Cold War series, Nuclear Standoff. The Age of Mad, Mutually Assured Destruction. Episode 19, identifying victory in war had brought peace, but also the power to destroy all life on Earth. 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, now faced each other across an invisible battlefield. This was the beginning of the age of nuclear standoff, a balance of terror known as mad, mutually assured destruction. Join us as we uncover 6 defining chapters in the Cold War, a struggle that changed history without a single direct battle. 1. America's nuclear monopoly. In 1945,
United States and the Soviet Union now faced each other across an invisible battlefield. This was the beginning of the age of nuclear standoff. A balance of
atomic
terror
bombs
known as
on
glad mutually assured destruction.
and
Join us as we uncover six defining
The world watched in
Cold War, a struggle that changed
horror
history
as
without a single direct
highest
battle.
cities
America's
vanished in
nuclear
seconds.
For
For a few years, America held a monopoly on this terrifying power. But in 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, instantly ending the US monopoly. The world had changed forever. No nation without fear of retaliation. 2. The logic of MAD. The superpowers faced a paradox. If one attacked, the other would retaliate and both would be destroyed. This doctrine became known as mutually assured destruction. It was a fragile piece held together by fear, not trust. Every decision, every crisis would now carry the weight of potential annihilation. 3. The arms race began. The 1950s and 60s saw an unprecedented race. Each to build more missiles, bigger bombs, and advanced deliveries. Hydrogen bombs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines technology became the ultimate weapon of intimidation. The world became a dangerous place. One misstep could trigger catastrophe. 4. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The ultimate test came in October of 1962. Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba just miles from Florida. For 13 days, the world held its breath. President John F. Kennedy demanded removal. Nikita Khrushchev resisted. For the first time, nuclear war seemed imminent. In the end, diplomacy prevailed. The Soviets removed missiles. The United promised not to invade Cuba. But the world had seen how close it had come to total annihilation. 5. The culture of fear across the globe. Ordinary people lived under the shadow of the bomb. Bomb shelters, drills, and propaganda became part of daily life. And despite the fear, both nations continued to expand their arsenals because in this new era, weakness was more dangerous than strength. 6. The global consequences. The nuclear standoff shaped not just governments, but culture, diplomacy, and society. It sparked peace movements, treaties, and the first real conversations about global survival.
As you can see, yesterday first game one.
The world learned that in the age of MAD, humanity itself was the ultimate hostage. For decades, the superpowers lived under the threat of total destruction. The nuclear standoff was never just a political strategy, it was a way of life. Every decision, every crisis, every Cold War showdown carried the shadow of annihilation. Subscribe for episode 4, The Korean War, the first Cold War battlefield. The Cold War series USA versus USSR. 40 years that changed the world.
About the channel, the games, and everything you need to know about the channel. You understand? Please and please, if you're a new member, please, as I said earlier, listen to this voice notes.
The Cold War, USA versus USSR, 40 years changed the world.
And,
Episode 4, The Korean War, the first Cold War battle. 1950s world map showing Korea between China, the Soviet Union, and Japan. After World War II, the world hoped for peace. But on a small peninsula in East Asia, the fragile balance between East and West would erupt into open war. This was the Korean War, the first battlefield of the Cold War, a conflict that never truly ended and still divides a nation today. Join us as we cover 5 defining chapters in the Cold War. 1. A nation divided. For centuries, Korea had been a union prairie. Instead, it became permanent a symbolic line between communism and capitalism. In 1948, 2 rival governments were declared. The Communist North under Kim Il-sung and the anti-communist South under Syngman Rhee. Both claimed to be the rightful government of all Korea. War was only a matter of time. 2. The war begins on June 25, 1950. North Korean forces cross the 38th parallel in a massive surprise attack. Backed by Soviet weapons and training, they swept through the south in weeks, capturing Seoul and pushing US and South Korean troops to the edge of defeat. The United Nations, led by the United States, rushed to defend South Korea. 16 nations sent troops, the first international military coalition of the Cold War. 3. The tide turns. In September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launched a daring amphibious assault at Incheon. The operation turned the tide of war. Seoul was recaptured, and UN forces pushed deep into North Korea, nearing the Chinese border. But victory was short-lived. China entered the war with hundreds of thousands of troops. The UN forces were driven back in one of the harshest winters on record. The front lines froze again near the 30th parallel, right where it all began. 4. Stalemate and fire. For 2 years, the war dragged on in brutal stalemate. Village was ever signed. To this day, North and South Korea remain technically at war. 5. The cost and legacy. The Korean War left more than 3 million people dead, soldiers and civilians alike. It was the first clash of the Cold War, proving that the US and the Soviet Union could fight each other directly through proxy wars and divided nations. Decades later, the scars of that war still shape global politics. The Korean Peninsula remains one of the most heavily fortified on Earth. A living reminder of the Cold War's first battle. The Korean War showed the world that the Cold War could turn hot, and all nations could become the center of global struggles. In the next episode, the superpowers take their rivalry to Earth as the space race begins. Subscribe for episode 5, The Space Race. Science became a weapon. The Cold War series, USA versus USSR. 40 years that changed the world.
The Korean Peninsula remains one of the most heavily fortified on Earth. A living reminder of the Cold War's first battle. The Korean War showed the world that the Cold War
The Cold War, USA, USSR, 40 years that changed the world. Episode 5, The Space Race, when science became a weapon. It began with a single sound, a single radio pulse from the stars. On October 4th, 1957, that pulse came from a silver sphere called Sputnik. It was the first man-made object to orbit the Earth, and it changed the night. To the west, it was a shock. To the east, a triumph. And from that on, the Cold War was no longer just about land or weapons. It was about the skies above. Join us as we uncover 5 defining chapters in the Cold War. 1. The Sputnik shock. The Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik 1 stunned the United States. It wasn't just a scientific victory, it was a statement of power. If the Soviets could launch a satellite into orbit, they could also launch a nuclear warhead across the planet. Space age had begun. But from fear. 2. America strikes back within months. The United States created a new agency, NASA, to lead its race into space. Billions of dollars were poured into rocket design, satellite research, and astronaut training. Scientists became heroes. Engineers became soldiers in a new kind of war. One measured not in casualties, but in discoveries. And as each side looked to the stars, they saw not just the future of science, but the future of global power. 3. The battle for prestige. In 1961, the Soviets struck first again. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space and the first to orbit Earth. He returned a global hero, proved that the Soviet system could match and surpass the West. In Washington, the challenge was clear. President John F. Kennedy stood before the world and declared, "We choose to go to the moon." The race was on not just to orbit Earth, but to reach another world. 4. Moonshot. The moon became the ultimate prize, a symbol of technological supremacy. Both nations pushed science to its limits. Rockets exploded, missions and lives were lost. But each setback drove innovation. Out of rivalry came invention, computers, satellites, new materials, the tool of modern life. Then, in July 1969, humanity crossed a threshold. That's one small man. When the United States landed Apollo 11 on the moon, it wasn't just an American victory. It was a moment that belonged to all kind proof of what competition could achieve, and a reminder of what mission could one day bring. 5. Beyond the race after the moon landing, this began to cool. The costs and the world was changing. But the technology born from the transformed human nation. Satellites now circled Earth, guiding communication, weather, and exploration. And in 1975, the same rivals who once raced to conquer met there instead. The Apollo's mission, an American spacecraft docking with a sun, marked the first hand in space. For a brief moment, the Cold War paused. Humanity looked back and fragile against the infinite. The space race proved that even in rivalry, progress can soar. The battle for the heavens gave birth to technology and showed that the greatest frontier was not above us, but within our ability to dream, to build, and to rise beyond fear. Subscribe for episode 5, The Cuban Missile Crisis, 15 Days That World. The Cold War series USA versus USSR, 40 years that changed the world.
The battle for the heavens gave birth to humanity showed the space race greatest frontier was that even in rivalry, progress can soar. The battle for the heavens gave birth to technology showed that the greatest rise beyond fear was not. Subscribe for episode 5, The Cuban Missile Crisis. In our ability to dream, the Cold War series USA and to rise beyond fear. Subscribe for episode 5, 40 Cuban Missile Crisis. The battle for 10 days that world. The Cold War series USA versus USSR. 40
Episode 1. The Cold War Explained. From allies to enemies. They fought side by side to defeat Adolf Hitler. But only a few short years later, they stood on opposite sides of an invisible battlefield. Two nations once allies, now trapped in a 40-year struggle for power, fear, and ideology.
Episode 1.
We uncover 5 defining chapters in the Cold War, a struggle that changed history without a single direct battle. 1. The end of World War II. In 1945, the Second World War came to an end. The victors, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union celebrated triumph over tyranny. Yet peace did not bring harmony. It brought suspicion. The world's two rising superpowers, Washington and Moscow, no longer needed each other. Now, each feared what the other might become. At the peace conferences, they promised cooperation, but beneath the polite words, mistrust ran deep. Joseph Stalin feared Western betrayal. The West feared Stalin's ambitions. Two ideologies, one planet. The world was no longer divided by
needed
or
needed each other. Now, each fears what the other might. They promised cooperation, but beneath the polite words, had promised cooperation. But beneath the Joseph Stalin feared mistrust ran deep.
On the other, fear and one-party rule. Beyond it, prosperity, freedom, and anxiety of a different kind. 4. The American response, Truman Doctrine and Martin. In 1947, President Harry Truman announced a new policy, the Truman Doctrine, promising to help any nation resisting
the American response, Doctrine and Martin.
The following year came the Marshall Plan, a massive effort pouring billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe. Where Americans saw generosity, Stalin saw manipulation. A Western
American response
plot to buy loyalty and
the American response, Truman
Soviet Union with
Doctrine and Martin. In 1947, Truman
was no longer one continent.
The doctrine follows President Trump promised to
divided by
to help any a massive episode 1. The Cold War explained. From allies to enemies. They fought side by side to defeat Adolf Hitler. But only a few short years later, they stood on opposite sides of an invisible battle. Two nations, once allies, now trapped in a struggle for power, fear, and ideology. Join us as we uncover 5 defining chapters in the fight to defeat Adolf Hitler. But only a few short years later, a struggle that changed history without a single direct threat. Two nations, once allies, now trapped. The end of World War II. In 1945, the Second World War came to an end. The victors, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union celebrated the triumph over tyranny. Yet peace did not bring peace. In 1946, the world's two rising superpowers, Washington and Moscow, no longer needed each other. Now, each feared what the other might become. At the peace conferences, they promised cooperation, but beneath the polite words, the end of mistrust, the world's two rising superpowers. Joseph Stalin feared the Western betrayal. The West feared Stalin's ambitions. Two ideologies, one planet. The world was no longer divided by oceans or borders, it was divided by ideas. On one side stood capitalism and democracy, led by the United States. On the other, communism and state control, commanded by the Soviets. Each believed its system would save humanity. Each saw the other as a threat to the future. 3. Europe divided, the Iron Curtain descended. As Soviet armies liberated Europe, they never withdrew. Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, all fell under Moscow. In 1946, Winston Churchill warned the world, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind it, censorship, fear, and one party rule. Beyond it, prosperity, freedom, and anxiety of a different kind. Winston Churchill warned the world. And 4. The response, the Truman Doctrine, Europe divided, the Iron Curtain, behind it, censorship, fear, and party rule. 47. President Harry Truman announced a policy, the Truman Doctrine, promising to help any nation resist the Cold War exploded. Europe was no longer one from allies to enemies. Two worlds. They fought side by side to defeat Adolf Hitler. But only a few short years later, nuclear shat on opposite sides of an. In 1949, the Soviet two nations once allies are now trapped in a 40-year struggle for power, America's fear, and ideology. Join us as we uncover 5 defining chapters in the Cold War, a struggle that changed history without a single direct battle. This uneasy peace was held at the end of World War II. In 1945, the Second World War, the victors of the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union celebrated a triple-decade period. The peace did not reach every corner brought suspicion. The world's two rising superpowers, Washington and Moscow, no longer knew each other. Now, each feared what the other. Cold War was never. At the peace conferences, never truly. It was a battle of vigilance. Fight to the soul.
Now,
the Cold War was USA versus USSR. Streets of Berlin, mountains of one side of Cuba led by the streets of Europe divided. The
how Europe liberation. Across Europe. But there was also pride. But there was also pride. Pride in rebuilding, in equality, in being part of a powerful socialist bloc. Meanwhile, in the West, freedom brought its own prosperity with communist Berlin.
And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil, and go, I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite. For I have provided me a king among his sons. 2 And Samuel said, How can I go? If Saul hear it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, Take an heifer with thee, and say, I am come to sacrifice to the Lord. 3 And call Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will shew thee what thou shalt do, and thou shalt anoint unto me him whom I name unto thee. 4 And Samuel did that which the Lord spake, and came to Bethlehem. And the elders of the town trembled at his coming, and said, Comest thou peaceably? 5 And he said, Peaceably? I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify yourselves, and come with me to the sacrifice. And he sanctified Jesse and his sons, and called them to the sacrifice. 6 And it came to pass, when they were come, that he looked on Eliab, and said, Surely the Lord's anointed is before him. 7 But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, or on the height of his stature. Because I have refused him, for the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. 8 Then Jesse called Abinadab. And made him pass before Samuel. And he said, Neither hath the Lord chosen this. 9 Then Jesse made Shammah to pass by. And he said, Neither hath the Lord chosen this. 10 Again, when they were come, that he looked on Elias, Jesse made 7 of his sons to pass before Samuel. And Samuel said unto Jesse, The Lord hath not chosen these. 11 And Samuel said unto Jesse, Hear all thy children. And he said, There remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he come hither. 12 And he sent, and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. 13. Then Samuel took the horn of oil, and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up, and went to Ramah. 14. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. And an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. 15. And Saul's servants said unto him, Behold now, an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. 16.